Sell or else. The words were sprayed across my cabin wall in blood-red paint. They destroyed everything while I was gone, tore down the back porch with crowbars, smashed the windows, left their message dripping like a wound. The HOA thought they could break me. They thought a widower living alone in the Virginia mountains would simply pack up and leave. They were wrong. I had cameras that they never found. I had evidence they never expected. And I had an electric fence that would change everything. This is how I made them regret it in court. I woke at 5:30 that October morning, the same way I had every morning since Ellen passed. The cabin was silent except for the settling of old wood and the faint crackle of embers dying in the fireplace. Outside, fog clung to the Blue Ridge Valley like a secret, thick and white and utterly still. Let me know in the comments where you are watching from today, because this story involves something that could happen to anyone who owns property in an HOA community. I lay there listening to the familiar sounds of this place I had purchased 18 months ago from a retired professor who said the mountains would either save me or swallow me whole. The oak floorboards groaned beneath my feet as I rose. The same complaint they had made since 1987 when the cabin was first built, and I found comfort in their consistency. The kitchen was cold, so I fed the wood stove first, then set water to boil for coffee. I still used the pour-over method Ellen had taught me, still measured the grounds by hand, still waited exactly 4 minutes before the first pour. Ritual was the architecture of grief. It gave shape to days that would otherwise dissolve into nothing. While the coffee dripped, I retrieved my leather notebook from the side table, the same brown journal I had carried throughout my 32 years as an electrical engineer. Documentation was a habit. Documentation was instinct. I opened to a fresh page and wrote the date, then a single line, clear morning, fog in the valley, cardinals at the feeder, small details proving I was still here, still paying attention to a world that continued turning despite everything I had lost. I carried my coffee to the back porch and began my daily walk along the property line. 2.3 acres of forest and meadow, bordered by oak posts I had driven myself during my first summer here. Each post was painted white at the top, marking the boundary of what was mine. The northern edge ran along federal forest land. The western side followed a seasonal creek, but the southern boundary, connecting my property to the main road of Pinewood Estates, was where I stopped cold. The third post from the corner was leaning several degrees off vertical. The soil around its base looked disturbed, darker than the surrounding earth. I crouched down and saw fresh boot prints in the soft ground, the partial impression of a shovel blade pressed into mud. My stomach tightened, but then I stood and brushed dirt from my knees. Probably neighborhood kids cutting through. Maybe deer had been rubbing against the wood. I had seen loose posts before during wet seasons, and this autumn had been rainy. I made a mental note to reset it over the weekend and walked on, telling myself there was no reason to assume the worst. That decision to dismiss what my eyes had clearly shown me would haunt me for months. That afternoon, my neighbor Stephanie Cox waved from her porch as I returned from the mailbox. She was 71, silver-haired and sharp-eyed, a woman who had spent 25 years as a circuit court judge before retiring to these mountains. We had become friends through brief conversations and mutual respect for silence. "Brandon," she called out, her voice carrying through the autumn air. "Did you see the HOA vehicle yesterday parked at the intersection for nearly an hour? Just sitting there." I told her I had not noticed. She nodded slowly, her judicial expression revealing nothing. "Probably nothing," she said, "but I have learned to notice when things feel wrong." I thanked her and went inside, thinking little of it, unaware that her observation had just handed me the second piece of a puzzle I did not yet know existed. An envelope was waiting on my kitchen table. White paper. The Pinewood Estates logo is embossed in green and gold. Inside was a notice for an emergency meeting to discuss new regulations for Zone C. I checked the community map hanging in my hallway. Zone C contained exactly 2 properties, my cabin and Stephanie's house. The letter requested discussion of modernization standards and infrastructure improvements. Language so bland, it felt deliberately empty. But at the bottom, in small print, were words that made me pause. Your presence is mandatory. In 15 years of living in various HOA communities before this one. I had never seen attendance described as mandatory. I set the letter aside and told myself it was bureaucratic overreach. Nothing more. Another dismissal I would come to regret. That night, I sat by the fire, attempting to lose myself in thought, around 9:47. Headlights swept across my window. An engine idled on the road for several minutes, close enough that I could hear its low rumble through the walls. Then silence returned, as suddenly as it had been broken. I rose and looked out, but saw only darkness and the pale shapes of trees against a moonless sky. No taillights retreating, no explanation offered. In my notebook, I wrote 9:47 p.m., unknown vehicle, Virginia plates. Idled for 5 minutes. Purpose unclear. I closed the journal and went to bed, not knowing that I had just recorded the first entry in a file that would eventually bring down the president of the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association and expose a pattern of corruption stretching back nearly a decade. The community hall of Pinewood Estates smelled of fresh paint and old money. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow across rows of folding chairs arranged with military precision. I arrived 10 minutes early and chose a seat in the back row, where I could observe without being observed. The room filled slowly with residents I recognized from occasional waves at mailboxes, retired couples in pressed khakis and cardigans, people who had chosen these mountains for the same quiet I sought. At exactly 7 o'clock, Gerald Hoffman strode to the podium at the front of the room. He wore a charcoal gray suit with a navy tie, his silver hair combed back with deliberate care. His wife Diane sat at a small table beside him, pen poised over a leather-bound notebook, ready to record every word. Gerald smiled at the crowd with the practiced warmth of a man who had spent decades selling things to people who did not need them. I pressed record on my phone and slipped it into my breast pocket, lens facing outward. "Friends and neighbors," Gerald began, his voice smooth as polished wood. "Pinewood Estates stands at a crossroads. We have an opportunity to modernize, to enhance our community for future generations." He clicked a remote, and a projection screen descended behind him, displaying architectural renderings of widened roads, a gleaming recreation center, upgraded utility infrastructure. The images were beautiful in a generic, soulless way, the kind of development that erased character in the name of progress. "These improvements will increase property values across the board," Gerald continued. "But to move forward, we must address certain areas that have fallen behind current standards. Specifically, Zone C requires significant restructuring to align with our community vision." His eyes found mine across the room, holding my gaze for a moment too long before moving on. The woman beside me, a retired schoolteacher whose name I could not recall, leaned close and whispered, "He bought 3 lots last year alone, pressured the owners until they caved, paid 40% below market value." I nodded and said nothing, but my hand moved to ensure the phone was still recording. The presentation continued for another 20 minutes, filled with charts and projections and carefully vague language about community enhancement. When Gerald opened the floor for questions, no one raised a hand. The silence felt heavy with unspoken fear, the particular quiet of people who had learned that speaking up brought consequences. Gerald smiled again, interpreting the silence as agreement. "Wonderful," he said. "We will proceed with preliminary assessments. Expect correspondence regarding individual property evaluations." The meeting adjourned, and residents filed out quickly, avoiding eye contact with each other and with Gerald, who stood by the door shaking hands like a politician after a campaign speech. I waited until the crowd thinned before rising, hoping to leave unnoticed. But Gerald intercepted me before I reached the exit, his hand extended, his grip firm and lingering when I accepted it. "Mr. Roberts," he said, pronouncing my name with exaggerated care. "I don't believe we have had the pleasure of a proper introduction. Gerald Hoffman, HOA president and founder of Hoffman Realty." I studied his face as he spoke, searching for the predator beneath the veneer of neighborly concern. His eyes were pale blue, calculating, constantly assessing. "Your cabin is quite something," he continued, not releasing my hand. "Original 1987 construction, if I recall correctly. Beautiful property, but a man living alone, maintaining 2 acres of land, that must be exhausting. The repairs, the upkeep, the property taxes." He shook his head with practiced sympathy. "I could make you a very comfortable offer, Mr. Roberts. Allow you to relocate somewhere more manageable, less isolated." I withdrew my hand and met his gaze directly. "The cabin is not for sale, Mr. Hoffman." His smile did not waver, but something shifted behind his eyes, a flicker of annoyance quickly suppressed. "Everything has a price, Mr. Roberts. That is simply the nature of property." I felt my jaw tighten, but kept my voice level. "Not this property," I said. "Not to me." He studied me for a long moment, then clapped me on the shoulder with false camaraderie. "We will talk again," he said. "I have a feeling we will be seeing quite a lot of each other." He turned away to greet another resident, and I walked out into the cold night air, my skin crawling with the certainty that I had just made an enemy. The envelope was waiting in my mailbox when I returned home, though I had checked it just hours before leaving for the meeting. White paper, green and gold logo, official letterhead of the Pinewood Estates Homeowners Association. Inside was a document titled Violation Notice Number 1. The violation alleged that my cabin failed to meet community paint standards as outlined in Section 4.7.2 of the Covenants. Conditions and restrictions. I was required to repaint the entire exterior within 30 days using colors from an approved palette, or face fines of $100 per day until compliance was achieved. I pulled my copy of the original CC&Rs from the filing cabinet where I kept all my property documents. I had reviewed these covenants thoroughly before purchasing the cabin, as any careful buyer would. I searched for Section 4.7.2. It did not exist. The document jumped from Section 4.6 directly to Section 4.8. There was no mention of exterior paint colors anywhere in the covenant restrictions for Zone C. I photographed the violation notice, then photographed the relevant pages of the CC&Rs. In my notebook, I wrote, "First violation notice received." The section cited does not exist in governing documents. Fabricated regulation. I underlined the last 2 words twice, then sat in the darkness of my kitchen, understanding finally that the leaning fence post and the watching vehicle and the mandatory meeting were not coincidences. They were the opening moves in a game I had not known I was playing. 2 weeks after the meeting, I walked my property line at dawn, as I always did, coffee steaming in my hand, notebook tucked under my arm. The October air had sharpened into something closer to winter, carrying the scent of decaying leaves and distant wood smoke. I moved along the northern boundary first, then west toward the creek, finding everything as it should be. But when I reached the southern edge, where my land met the main road of Pinewood Estates, I stopped so abruptly that coffee sloshed over my wrist. 3 posts were wrong, not just leaning this time, but completely repositioned. I set down my cup and approached slowly, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. The white-painted tops that I had driven into the ground myself now stood 8 feet further inside my property than they should have been. 8 feet of my land, simply erased. The soil around each post was freshly turned, the marks of a shovel still visible in the dark earth. I photographed everything from multiple angles, then retrieved the measuring tape I kept in my truck and documented the exact displacement. In my notebook, I recorded the date, the time, the precise measurements, and the condition of the disturbed soil. Someone had come onto my property in the darkness and moved my boundary markers. Someone wanted me to believe that my land was smaller than the deed said it was. I called Thompson Land Surveying that same morning and requested an official assessment. Jim Thompson arrived 2 days later, a weathered man in his 60s who had been surveying properties in Bedford County for 3 decades. He spent 4 hours walking my perimeter with equipment I did not recognize, taking readings and consulting maps, and muttering to himself in the way of professionals who have seen too much to be surprised by anything. When he finished, he spread his findings across my kitchen table and pointed to the discrepancy with a calloused finger. "Your deed is clear, Mr. Roberts. The original boundary markers, the ones you placed based on the recorded survey, were accurate. Someone moved them inward by exactly 8 feet along this entire stretch." He tapped the southern line on his map. "This was not erosion or animal activity or natural shifting. This was deliberate. Someone wanted to claim a strip of your land without filing any paperwork." I asked him if he had seen this before. He nodded slowly. "Twice in 30 years. Both times it was a neighbor dispute that turned ugly. But 8 feet along a property line this long." He shook his head. "That is not a dispute. That is a land grab." I paid him for his services and requested 2 certified copies of his report, one for my files and one for whatever came next. The evidence was building, layer by layer, each piece connecting to the last. The second violation notice arrived 3 days after the surveyor's visit. This time, the HOA claimed that trees on my property were obstructing the sight lines of the public road, creating a safety hazard that required immediate remediation. I was ordered to cut down or drastically trim 7 mature oaks within 14 days, trees that had stood on this land for over 40 years without a single complaint. I called the HOA office to request clarification, and Diane Hoffman answered with the clipped efficiency of someone reading from a script. "The regulations have been updated to reflect current safety standards. Mr. Roberts, Zone C is being brought into compliance with the rest of the community." I asked when these regulations had been updated and by what vote of the membership. She paused for a moment too long before responding. "The board has the authority to implement safety measures without general membership approval. It is all in the bylaws." I thanked her and hung up, then checked the bylaws I had kept since purchasing the property. No such authority existed. Another fabrication. Another lie dressed in the language of procedure. I added the second violation notice to my file and photographed the trees in question, documenting their distance from the road, their healthy condition, and their decades of unobstructed coexistence with the community. That evening, I installed 4 security cameras around the exterior of my cabin. Nest cameras, purchased online and delivered within 48 hours, were positioned to cover the driveway, the southern boundary, the main entrance, and the back porch. The installation was simple for someone with my background in electrical engineering, and I ensured that each camera had a clear line of sight and a reliable power supply. I did not announce this addition to anyone. I simply watched and waited. The first 2 nights showed nothing unusual, just deer crossing the meadow and raccoons investigating my garbage cans. But on the 3rd night, at 2:17 in the morning, the southern camera captured a figure moving along my property line. The image was grainy in the darkness, illuminated only by the pale glow of a flashlight. But I could see enough. A man in dark clothing, carrying a shovel, was walking slowly along the boundary I had just had resurveyed. He paused at each post, examined it, then moved on. I could not see his face, but I saved the footage and added it to my growing file. Proof of surveillance. Proof of intent. The walls were closing in. But now I had eyes in the darkness. Stephanie visited the following afternoon, carrying a basket of apples from the small orchard behind her house. We sat on my front porch, drinking coffee, while the autumn wind scattered leaves across the yard. "They have done this before. Brandon," she said quietly, her judicial eyes fixed on the tree line. "Gerald Hoffman has driven 4 families out of this community in the past 6 years. The Hendersons, the Nguyens, the Parkers, the Okonkwo's. All of them owned property in Zone C. All of them received violation notices that escalated until selling seemed like the only option." She handed me a folded piece of paper with 4 names and phone numbers written in her careful handwriting. "I kept track because I knew someday someone would need to know. Someone who would not run." I looked at the list, then at her weathered face, and understood that she had been waiting for this moment. "You need to start building a real file," she said. "And you need to find a lawyer who specializes in HOA abuse, because what is coming next will be worse than violation notices and moved fence posts." She finished her coffee and rose to leave, pausing at the steps to look back at me. "Document everything. Brandon, every letter, every phone call, every strange vehicle on the road. When the time comes, evidence will be the only thing that matters." I nodded and watched her walk away, the list of names folded carefully in my pocket, the weight of her warning settling into my bones. The 5th week began with another envelope in my mailbox. Violation Notice Number 3 declared that my cabin had been reclassified as an unauthorized structure, citing a zoning amendment that allegedly rendered my back porch non-compliant with current building standards. The notice demanded that I demolish the porch within 30 days or face escalating fines and potential legal action. I drove to the Bedford County Administrative Office that same afternoon and requested copies of my original building permits. The clerk, a tired woman in her 50s who had clearly seen every kind of property dispute imaginable, found the records within minutes. The back porch had been constructed in 1992 with full permits, inspections, and approvals from the county. Every document bore official stamps and signatures. The structure was entirely legal and had been for over 3 decades. I made certified copies of everything and sent them to the HOA office via registered mail. Requesting written acknowledgement of receipt, no response came. The silence felt deliberate, a void designed to unsettle rather than resolve. I added the 3rd violation notice and the permit documentation to my file, which now occupies an entire drawer of my filing cabinet. The 6th week brought a new kind of attack. I returned home from grocery shopping on a Tuesday evening to find my cabin dark. The porch light that I always left burning was off. The interior lights I had set on timers were off. Everything was off. I checked the circuit breaker inside and found it functioning normally, all switches in their proper positions. The problem was not inside my home. I retrieved a flashlight and followed the electrical line from my cabin to the utility pole near the road, walking carefully through the darkness that had swallowed my property. Halfway along the run, I found the damage. The main power line had been severed cleanly, the cut edges gleaming in my flashlight beam with the precision of professional tools. This was not weather damage or animal interference. Someone had taken wire cutters to my electricity. I called the power company and waited 3 hours in the cold darkness for a technician to arrive. He examined the cut with a frown deepening on his face. "Mr. Roberts, I have been doing this job for 18 years. This line did not fail naturally. Someone cut it deliberately, probably with lineman's pliers." He repaired while I documented everything with photographs, adding the images and his verbal assessment to my records. Before he left, he handed me his card and told me I should file a police report. The look in his eyes said he knew exactly what was happening and felt powerless to stop it. I went to the Bedford County Sheriff's Office the next morning and filed a formal complaint. Trespassing, vandalism, destruction of property. The deputy who took my statement was polite but non-committal, explaining that without direct evidence identifying the perpetrator, there was little they could do beyond creating a record. I asked for a copy of the report for my files. He provided it without comment, his expression suggesting he had taken many such reports that led nowhere. But I was not looking for immediate justice. I was building a foundation. Brick by brick, document by document, every official record strengthened my position. Every timestamp created a trail. The police report joined the surveyor's assessment, the violation notices, the permit copies, and the photographs of cut electrical lines. My evidence file was becoming something substantial, something that could not be easily dismissed. In the 7th week, I made the mistake of leaving. My sister in Richmond had been asking me to visit for months, and I convinced myself that 3 days away would provide perspective. I asked Stephanie to watch my property, gave her my phone number, and drove east on a Wednesday morning with the naive belief that my presence was what had been protecting my home. I was wrong. Stephanie called me on Friday evening, her voice tight with controlled alarm. "Brandon, you need to come back. Something has happened." I drove through the night, 4 hours of darkness and growing dread, arriving at my cabin just as dawn began to lighten the eastern sky. What I found made me stop the truck in the middle of the driveway, unable to move, unable to breathe. The back porch was gone, not damaged, not vandalized, but completely demolished. Splintered wood tissue scattered across the yard like the bones of something killed and left to rot. The windows of the living room had been smashed inward, glass glittering on the floor inside. And across the front wall of my cabin, sprayed in paint the color of dried blood, were 3 words that burned themselves into my memory. Sell or else. I walked through the destruction in a daze, photographing everything with hands that trembled despite my efforts to steady them. The security cameras I had installed were destroyed, torn from their mounts, and the memory cards removed. Whoever had done this knew exactly where to look, exactly what to eliminate. They had been thorough and methodical and utterly without conscience. But they had missed one thing. 3 weeks earlier, following Stephanie's advice to document everything, I had installed a 5th camera. It was hidden inside an old birdhouse mounted on an oak tree at the edge of the meadow, positioned to capture anyone approaching from the southern boundary. The birdhouse was weathered and unremarkable, the kind of thing that faded into the landscape. I retrieved it with shaking hands and connected the memory card to my laptop. The footage was dark and grainy, but clear enough. At 11:23 on Thursday night, a white pickup truck had parked on the road. At 11:31, 3 men emerged wearing dark masks. One of them carried a crowbar. Another had a sledgehammer. The third held a can of spray paint. They worked for nearly an hour, systematic and unhurried, destroying my porch while I slept 200 miles busy in my sister's guest room. But the camera had captured something they never expected. When the man with the spray paint raised his arm to write his message, his sleeve pulled back to reveal a tattoo on his forearm, a distinctive design, the logo of the Bedford County Cougars, the local high school football team. I had seen that tattoo before. It belonged to Troy Barnes, the HOA's maintenance supervisor, a man who had waved to me just 2 weeks ago while trimming hedges near the community entrance. I sat in the ruins of my home as the sun rose higher, watching the footage again and again, memorizing every detail. They had wanted me to run. They had wanted me to feel afraid and alone and powerless. But sitting there among the broken wood and shattered glass, I felt something else entirely. I felt the cold clarity of a man who finally understood the nature of his enemy. In my notebook, I wrote a single line they wanted me to be scared. Ellen, they do not know who they are dealing with. Then I closed the journal and began planning my counterattack. I drove to Roanoke 3 days after the destruction, following a recommendation from Stephanie, who had made some calls on my behalf. The law office of Vasquez and Associates occupied the third floor of a brick building downtown, its windows overlooking a street lined with trees, turning gold and crimson in the late autumn light. Elena Vasquez met me in a conference room cluttered with case files and legal volumes, a woman in her mid-40s with dark hair pulled back severely and eyes that assessed me with immediate precision. She wore no jewelry except for a simple watch, and her handshake was firm enough to communicate that she did not waste time on pleasantries. "Mr. Roberts," she said, gesturing for me to sit. "Stephanie Cox tells me you have a problem with Gerald Hoffman." I set my evidence file on the table between us, a folder now thick with photographs, official documents, violation notices, and a USB drive containing the footage from my hidden camera. "I have more than a problem," I replied. "I have proof." She spent 45 minutes reviewing everything I had brought, her expression shifting from professional interest to something closer to controlled excitement as she examined each piece of evidence. When she reached the video footage, she watched it 3 times without speaking, pausing repeatedly on the frame that showed Troy Barnes's tattoo. Finally, she looked up at me with a thin smile that held no warmth, only the focused anticipation of a hunter who had finally found worthy prey. "5 years ago, I sued Gerald Hoffman on behalf of another family in Pinewood Estates," she said. "The Nguyen's. They came to me with stories of harassment, fabricated violations, and pressure to sell their home below market value. But I lost that case because I could not prove a direct connection between Hoffman and the harassment. Everything was circumstantial, deniable, filtered through layers of plausible deniability." She tapped the USB drive with one manicured fingernail. "This changes everything. You have his employee on camera destroying your property. You have a pattern of fabricated violations that mirrors what happened to other families. And you have something else that I did not have before." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "You have other victims willing to testify. Stephanie gave me their names. I have already made contact. 3 of the 4 families are prepared to give sworn statements about what Hoffman did to them." We spent the next 2 hours developing a strategy that would attack Gerald Hoffman from 3 directions simultaneously. First, a criminal complaint was filed with the Bedford County Commonwealth Attorney's Office, using the video evidence of Troy Barnes to anchor charges of vandalism, trespassing, and conspiracy. Second, a civil lawsuit against both the HOA and Gerald Hoffman personally, seeking damages for property destruction and violation of governing documents. Third, an administrative complaint with the Virginia Real Estate Board that would threaten his broker's license by documenting his pattern of acquiring properties from harassed homeowners. As Elena outlined each component, I felt something shift in my chest, a tightness I had not realized I was carrying, beginning to loosen. For weeks, I had been reacting, documenting, and enduring. Now, for the first time, I was preparing to strike back. The change felt physical, like stepping out of a dark room into cold, clear air. "This will not be quick," Elena warned. "Hoffman has money and lawyers and connections, but for the first time in 5 years, I believe we can win." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and understood that the man who had driven home from Richmond to find his cabin destroyed was not the same man sitting in this conference room. That man had been afraid. This man was ready. Before I left Roanoke, I stopped at a Tractor Supply store to purchase what I needed for the next phase of my defense. Virginia law permitted agricultural electric fences on private property under specific conditions, clear warning signs, voltage within safety limits, and proper grounding. As a retired electrical engineer, I understood these requirements intimately. I selected a Zareba Energizer rated for 25 miles of fence line, along with insulators, posts, high tensile wire, and 20 warning signs printed in bold red letters. The total came to just under $800. I loaded everything into my truck and drove home through the gathering dusk, my mind already mapping the installation route along my property perimeter. The fence would not be a weapon. It would be a boundary that could not be moved or ignored or violated without consequence. I spent the following week installing the system, working from dawn until dusk despite the increasingly bitter weather. The design was simple but effective, a single strand of electrified wire at waist height, powered by the Energizer in my tool shed, with warning signs posted every 10 feet along the entire perimeter. I photographed each component's placement and filed the required registration with the county agricultural office. When Stephanie came to inspect my work, she walked the boundary line with me, nodding at the documentation I had assembled. Legal, visible, and thorough, she said. No one can claim they were not warned. Standing there in the cold afternoon light, I felt the satisfaction of a problem solved through careful planning. My property was no longer a soft target. Anyone who crossed that line now would do so knowing exactly what awaited them. While I worked on the fence, Elena worked on building our case. She conducted video depositions with the Henderson family in Colorado, who described how their car had been vandalized after they refused Gerald's purchase offer. Listening to their testimony later, I recognized the exhaustion in their voices, the particular weariness of people who had fought and lost and were only now finding the courage to speak again. The Nguyen family in California provided scanned copies of violation notices citing non-existent regulations, documents so similar to my own that I felt a strange comfort in knowing I was not alone. The Parkers in Florida forwarded emails from Gerald offering to buy their property at 40% below market value, sent just weeks after a series of HOA fines had made their lives miserable. Each email was polite, professional, and utterly predatory. And the Okonkwo's in Texas contributed something invaluable, a recording of an HOA meeting in which Gerald had publicly threatened to make their lives difficult if they did not sell. Hearing his voice on that recording, smooth and confident and cruel, I understood for the first time the full scope of what we were fighting. This was not a man who had made a few bad decisions. This was a man who had built a system designed to steal from his neighbors. Year after year, family after family. Elena organized everything into a comprehensive file: physical evidence, HOA documentation, witness testimony, financial records showing Gerald's pattern of below-market acquisitions, and Troy Barnes's criminal history, including 2 prior convictions for property destruction. "We are not just building a case," she told me during one of our strategy calls. "We are documenting a criminal enterprise that has operated in plain sight for nearly a decade." I finished the fence on a Thursday evening as the first snow of winter began to fall. Standing at the edge of my property, I watched the flakes settle on the wire and the warning signs, transforming my boundary into something almost beautiful. My cabin was still damaged, with tarps covering broken windows, and the back porch was nothing but a concrete foundation. But I was no longer waiting for the next attack. In my notebook, I wrote fence complete, evidence gathered, legal strategy in motion, let them come. Doris Hill found me before I found her. She called on a Tuesday morning in early December, introducing herself as an investigative reporter for the Blue Ridge Gazette, who had been tracking HOA complaints across the region for nearly 2 years. Her voice was direct and unhurried, the tone of someone who had learned that patience yielded better stories than pressure. "Mr. Roberts, I have spoken with Elena Vasquez," she said. "She told me you might be willing to share your experience. I want you to know that I have already identified 11 formal complaints against Pinewood Estates HOA in the past 8 years. Yours is the first with documented evidence of criminal activity." I invited her to the cabin the following day, understanding that the story was about to become larger than my property line, larger than my personal grievance against Gerald Hoffman. The time for quiet documentation had passed. Now it was time to let the light in. Doris arrived in a dusty sedan with a camera bag over her shoulder and a digital recorder in her hand. She was perhaps 55, with graying hair cut short and practical, and eyes that moved constantly, cataloging details the way my engineering mind cataloged electrical systems. We walked the property together while she photographed the damaged cabin, the warning signs on my electric fence, the concrete foundation where my back porch had once stood. I showed her the surveyor's report documenting the moved boundary markers. I played her the footage from the hidden camera, watching her expression harden as Troy Barnes raised his arm to spray his message across my wall. She asked questions for nearly 3 hours, recording everything, taking notes in a small spiral notebook that reminded me of my own habit of documentation. When she finally lowered her recorder, she looked at me with something close to respect. "I have been waiting for a case like this," she said quietly. "Stories need proof. You have given me proof." The interview she conducted was thorough but not exploitative. She asked about Ellen, and I told her briefly about the grief that had brought me to these mountains, the healing I had been seeking before Gerald Hoffman decided my land was worth more than my peace. She asked why I had not simply sold and walked away, and I explained that some things cannot be measured in dollars, that the cabin represented something I was not willing to surrender to a man who believed everything had a price. She asked about the electric fence, and I showed her the permits, the registration, the warning signs, and the careful documentation that proved I had followed every legal requirement. "Gerald will try to use that fence against you," she warned. "He will claim you are the dangerous one, the unstable neighbor who cannot get along with his community." I nodded, having anticipated this strategy. "Let him try," I said. "Every claim he makes will require him to explain why his employee was on my property at midnight with a crowbar." Doris smiled for the first time since arriving. That is exactly the quote I needed. The article appeared online the following week, then in print the Sunday after. The headline read, "HOA Terror, Pinewood Estates Residents Allege Pattern of Harassment by Association President." Doris had done more than simply tell my story. She had woven together 8 years of complaints, connecting dots that had remained invisible when each family suffered alone. The Hendersons were quoted as describing their vandalized car. The Nguyens provided copies of the fabricated violation notices. A financial analyst had examined public records and discovered that Gerald Hoffman's company had acquired 7 properties in Pinewood Estates over the past decade, all purchased from homeowners who had received multiple HOA violations in the months before selling. All purchased at prices significantly below market value. The article did not accuse Gerald of crimes. It simply laid out the facts in careful, documented detail and let the pattern speak for itself. Gerald declined to comment when Doris contacted him. His silence said more than any statement could have. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Within 48 hours, the article had been shared thousands of times across community forums and neighborhood groups throughout Bedford County and beyond. Comments poured in from residents of Pinewood Estates who had remained silent for years, afraid of retaliation if they spoke against Gerald's administration. One woman described being fined for the color of her mailbox. A retired Marine recounted how Gerald had threatened to deny his children access to the community pool unless he voted a certain way at HOA meetings. An elderly couple revealed that they had sold their home of 20 years after receiving 17 violation notices in a single month, each one citing regulations they could not find in any governing document. The stories were remarkably similar, a chorus of voices finally finding the courage to sing. Elena called me that evening, her professional composure cracked by something that sounded almost like joy. 12 new families have contacted my office wanting to join a class action lawsuit, she said. Gerald Hoffman's world is about to get very small. The emergency HOA meeting was called for the following Thursday. and I attended with my phone recording in my pocket, just as I had at the first meeting months ago. The community hall that had once felt like Gerald's personal throne room now crackled with tension. Residents who had previously avoided eye contact now sat together in clusters, whispering and glancing toward the podium where Gerald stood with his wife Diane, his charcoal suit slightly rumpled, his silver hair less perfectly combed than I remembered. He attempted to control the narrative, calling the article a coordinated smear campaign designed to undermine the community's leadership. But when he opened the floor for questions, hands shot up throughout the room. One man stood without being called upon and asked why Gerald's son worked for the company that had purchased every property sold under duress in Zone C. Gerald's face reddened. His voice rose. "That is a private business matter and has nothing to do with this association." Another resident stood. "Then why did you tell the Okonkwo's you would make their lives difficult if they did not sell?" The room erupted. Diane tried to restore order, but the dam had broken. Someone was recording on their phone. Someone else was live-streaming the chaos. Gerald pointed at me across the room, his composure finally shattering. "This is his doing. That man is a danger to this community. He put up an electric fence like some kind of lunatic." I said nothing. I did not need to. The woman beside me, the retired school teacher whose name I had finally learned was Margaret, stood and faced Gerald directly. "The only danger in this community," she said clearly, "is a man who thinks he can bully his neighbors into giving up their homes." The applause that followed was the sweetest sound I had heard in months, 3 weeks before the trial. My electric fence delivered its verdict ahead of the court, at 2:34 in the morning. The alarm system I had connected to the fence energizer woke me with a shrill beep indicating a significant voltage drop. Someone had made contact with the wire. I grabbed my phone and checked the camera feed I had installed after replacing the destroyed units. This time with cellular backup that stored footage directly to the cloud. The infrared image showed a figure lying on the ground near the southern boundary, convulsing slightly, one hand still gripping the fence wire. I recognized him immediately. Troy Barnes had returned to finish what he started, and the boundary I had built had stopped him cold. I called 911 and reported an intruder injured on my property. The paramedics arrived within 20 minutes, followed by 2 sheriff's deputies who found Troy conscious but disoriented, a pair of bolt cutters lying in the grass beside him. He had come to cut through my fence. The fence had other ideas. The attempted trespass charge filed against Troy Barnes became the crack that shattered Gerald Hoffman's entire operation. Facing felony charges for the cabin destruction, and now a new arrest for attempted breaking. Troy's loyalty evaporated like morning fog. His court-appointed attorney negotiated a deal, reduced charges in exchange for full cooperation with the Commonwealth Attorney's investigation into Gerald Hoffman. Within days, Troy had provided detailed testimony about every act of vandalism, every moved boundary marker, every cut power line. He named Gerald as the man who had ordered it all, who had paid cash bonuses for completed jobs, who had promised that no one would ever connect the crimes back to the HOA president. The conspiracy charges Elena had predicted were filed against Gerald the following week. The civil trial took place in Bedford County Circuit Court on a gray February morning. Judge Patricia Okonkwo presided, a woman whose name I recognized from Stephanie's list of families driven out by Gerald's tactics years ago, though she bore no relation to them and had disclosed this coincidence before accepting the case. Elena presented our evidence methodically, the video footage, the surveyor's report, the fabricated violation notices, and the testimony of 5 families who had suffered the same pattern of harassment. The financial records showed Gerald's below-market property acquisitions, Troy Barnes's sworn statement naming Gerald as the architect of a decade-long scheme to terrorize homeowners into selling their land, Gerald's attorney, an expensive litigator named Douglas Whitmore, attempted to redirect blame toward me. calling the electric fence evidence of my unstable character and aggressive nature. Elena dismantled this argument in minutes, presenting the permits, the warning signs, and the registration with the county. "My client followed every legal requirement," she said calmly. "Mr. Barnes chose to ignore 20 clearly posted warnings and trespass on private property at 2 in the morning with bolt cutters. The fence did exactly what it was designed to do." The cross-examination of Gerald Hoffman was brief, but devastating. Elena played the recording from the Okonkwo family's HOA meeting, letting his own voice fill the courtroom with threats and intimidation. She displayed the emails to the Parkers, the violation notices citing non-existent regulations, and the timeline showing how each targeted family received escalating harassment until they sold to companies connected to Gerald's son. When she asked Gerald directly whether he had ordered Troy Barnes to destroy my cabin, his attorney objected. But Troy had already answered that question under oath. Gerald's silence only confirmed what everyone in the courtroom already knew. Judge Okonkwo delivered her ruling 3 days later. Gerald Hoffman was found liable for property destruction, harassment, and violation of fiduciary duty as HOA president. The court awarded me $175,000 in damages, including repair costs, emotional distress, and attorney fees. A permanent restraining order prohibited Gerald or any HOA representative from approaching within 500 feet of my property. His countersuit claiming I had endangered Troy Barnes with the electric fence was dismissed with prejudice. The criminal case was referred to the Commonwealth attorney, and Gerald left the courthouse without speaking to the reporters gathered on the steps. I watched him go, feeling not triumph, but something quieter. The weight I had carried since finding my cabin, destroyed, finally began to lift. The consequences fell like dominoes in the months that followed. Troy Barnes pleaded guilty to vandalism and trespassing, receiving 18 months in state prison with the possibility of parole after 12. Gerald Hoffman resigned as HOA president 3 days after the civil verdict, facing mounting pressure from residents who had once feared him and now demanded accountability. The Virginia Real Estate Board suspended his broker's license pending a full investigation into Hoffman Realty's acquisition practices, effectively ending a business he had spent 30 years building. Diane Hoffman put their house on the market within weeks, and the couple left Pinewood Estates without farewell. Their departure, as quiet as their reign, had been loud. 3 additional civil lawsuits were filed against Gerald by families who had sold under duress, each case strengthened by the precedent our trial had established. The man who had believed everything had a price was finally learning the cost of his own arrogance. I watched all of this unfold with a strange detachment, as though observing a storm from the safety of a distant shore. There was no satisfaction in Gerald's ruin, no pleasure in seeing a man's life dismantled piece by piece. What I felt instead was exhaustion, followed slowly by something resembling peace. I had not sought revenge. I had sought only to keep what was mine and to stop a pattern of abuse that had already claimed too many victims. The scale of the aftermath surprised me. I had expected a verdict. I had not expected a movement. Some nights I sat on my damaged porch and wondered if Ellen would have approved of how I had handled things, whether she would have recognized the quiet, methodical man I had become through this ordeal. I believed she would have. She had always said that patience was not passive, that standing firm required more strength than striking back. The community began to heal in ways I had not anticipated. A special election replaced the dissolved HOA board with new members chosen by genuine Democratic vote, including Stephanie Cox as honorary legal advisor. The fabricated regulations Gerald had used as weapons were struck from the governing documents. Zone C was reclassified to reflect its original rural character, protecting the remaining properties from future development pressure. One Saturday morning in March, Margaret Thompson, the retired schoolteacher who had stood up for me at that chaotic meeting, stopped by with a casserole dish wrapped in aluminum foil. "My grandmother's recipe," she said, pressing it into my hands. "I wanted to thank you properly. My husband and I were ready to sell last year. After everything you did, we decided to stay." She looked around at the construction materials stacked on my porch, at the framework of new beams rising where the old structure had been torn away. "It looks like you are staying too." I told her I was. She smiled and squeezed my arm before walking back to her car. It was a small gesture, but it meant more than the verdict, more than the money, more than Gerald's public disgrace. It meant the neighborhood was becoming a community again. Doris Hill published a 5-part investigative series on HOA abuse across Virginia, using our case as the centerpiece. The series prompted 3 state legislators to introduce the Virginia HOA Accountability Act, requiring financial transparency and independent oversight for homeowner associations. The bill was still working its way through committee when spring arrived. But Elena was optimistic about its passage. What had started as one man's fight to keep his cabin had become something larger, a small stone creating ripples that spread far beyond Bedford County. I finished rebuilding the back porch in April, working with my own hands as I had when I first bought the property. The new structure was wider than the original, with enough room for 2 rocking chairs facing east toward the sunrise Ellen had loved. I sanded each board myself, feeling the grain smooth beneath my palms the way I had felt it decades ago when Ellen and I built our first bookshelf together in a tiny apartment in Richmond. The smell of fresh cedar brought back her voice, her laugh, the way she would brush sawdust from my shoulders and tell me I worked too slowly because I cared too much. The electric fence still hummed along my boundary, though I had added flowering vines that softened its appearance without compromising its function. Stephanie visited often, bringing apples from her orchard and news from the reformed HOA meetings. We would sit on the new porch drinking coffee, watching deer cross the meadow in the early morning light, speaking little because little needed to be said. One evening in late May, I opened my leather notebook to a fresh page and wrote what I had been unable to write for 2 years, Ellen. I kept this place. Not for the land or the wood or the view, but because this is where I feel you closest. They wanted me to run. They wanted me afraid. But I stood my ground with truth and law and patience, the way you always said justice required. The fence still stands. So do I. A year after the trial, I received an email from a stranger in Oregon. His HOA had begun targeting his property with fabricated violations. He had found Doris Hill's articles online and traced them back to me. He asked if I had any advice for someone just beginning the fight I had already won. I sat down at my kitchen table, the same table where I had opened that first violation notice so many months ago, and began to type. "The first thing you need to do," I wrote, "is start documenting everything in a notebook. Every letter, every phone call, every strange vehicle on your road. Evidence is the only language that power understands." I hit send and closed my laptop, then walked outside to watch the sunset paint the mountains gold and crimson. The boundary markers stood exactly where I had placed them. The warning signs glowed in the fading light, and somewhere in Oregon, another man was picking up his pen, ready to draw his own line in the earth.